Welcome to this week's episode of Cloud Busting. We are continuing with our trend episodes. In fact, this is the final trend episode, the sixth trend, which we are referring to as Don't Just Migrate, Modernize. This actually links back to the first trend that we came up with, which is we're in the modernization era. And we thought we'd take a bit of a deeper dive at what modernization actually is. And we're especially going to be looking at, in this post-pandemic age, once we're all coming out of this, there's going to be a bunch of modernization. But what's going to be the right pace to do this modernization at? We're going to dive into, can we do things quickly and get things onto the cloud and then modernize? Or should we be looking at modernizing as part of the migration strategy? And absolutely delighted to be joined by Jake Burns. Jake is an enterprise strategist at AWS. He is also host of a pod, which is fantastic, on the AWS Conversations with Leaders, available everywhere. Jake, do you want to just say hi, introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about yourself, and of course your podcast?
Yes, thank you. So I am an enterprise strategist with Amazon Web Services, and it's kind of a unique team within the company. We're comprised of former CIOs and CTOs who've had large-scale success in their previous role, leading a digital transformation using the AWS cloud. So in my case, I was VP of Cloud Services at Live Nation Ticketmaster and led the all-in migration to AWS that we successfully completed in 2017 and resulted in a 48% reduction in our total cost of ownership for IT and numerous other benefits that we can discuss if you want to get into that. So I've been in this role a little over 2 years, and primarily what we do is we engage with senior leaders from our biggest customers. I've done about 350 of those engagements and kind of share what worked for us, what didn't work for us, and what we're seeing out there working for other leaders and help them formulate their cloud strategy at the beginning of their cloud journey. We also take what we learn from all of these engagements and use that working with the various teams within AWS to make AWS better and more customer obsessed. So the AWS Conversations for Leaders podcast, we interview leaders from various organizations, CIOs and CTOs and other executives on various leadership topics, as well as leaders within Amazon, both AWS and Amazon at large. So it's kind of a look behind the scenes on how senior leaders within these companies think about how to organize for change and how to be successful in general.
Sounds great. And if you'd like our leader to join at any stage, I can definitely get you Dan.
Excellent.
Dan, producer man, good to have you on the show. How are you, mate?
I am well, thank you very much. I've got actually a bizarre thing to admit to today. You know how I'm usually very dismissive?
Is it the haircut?
I mean, aside from the haircut, which, by the way, the haircuts I'm doing by myself, they're getting steadily worse. So the sooner the barber goes...
I can tell.
The extremity of the sides is really getting there, isn't it? That must be like a number one on the side there.
Look, the thing I'm actually admitting to is that I've been very dismissive of Dave's music taste in the past, as people on the podcast can probably attest to over the last sort of 100 odd so episodes. But Dave, the KLF album that you recommended to me recently has become an incredibly useful soundtrack during my day in terms of like helping me be actually productive. So I suppose I've actually got to concede,
Brilliant.
That was actually a very strong recommendation there, sir.
Well, it had to happen. You know what's brought you into that, though, don't you?
Go on, Ed.
In fact, it's a concept album.
Oh, yeah, that's it.
Which one was it? Which KLF album was it? The original?
Chill Out.
Yeah.
It's been released on streaming for the first time very recently, like about a month ago or something, which is when we were having the conversation. And it's called Come Down Dawn on Spotify. But yeah, man, it's classic.
How are you doing though, Dave? You okay?
I love that.
Yeah, I'm okay, man. I'm not too bad at all, actually. My kids went back to school this week. It's brought back a new kind of going out at the beginning of the day structure, which feels quite novel. Feels quite novel. I'm very cautiously optimistic about the pulling out of lockdown thing, but it does feel like that we might have actually taken a bit of a step forward. Like, lockdown one, when we were coming out of it was like, well, we'll come out of it, but absolutely no reason to come out of it other than staying in for 3 months has broadly got the numbers down. This time, at least, we're coming out with, a bit of structure, an actual vaccine, like definite uplift in testing. So it just feels a bit more structurally controlled. I don't know. I don't want to speak too soon, but, fingers crossed.
I even booked some festival tickets at the weekend. I can't. I know. I was like, well, it's in August, so I was like, I got to have something to look forward to. I don't think there's going to be much international travel. a lot of the festivals have been cancelled, the big ones, but going to Festival, so I was like, yeah, book it, just get it in there. It's that little carrot that's waiting for me.
Well, Jez, you've got to have something to look forward to. And Jake, I suppose, for the sort of your benefit here, a lot of us are feeling like caged animals at the moment in the UK. So we're very much looking forward to getting out and about again.
Yeah, I think we all kind of feel that way a little bit.
What's been the lockdown state where you are, Jake?
So I'm in Las Vegas, Nevada. And so it's interesting because, as you probably know, this city's kind of foundation is tourism, and that's been hit pretty hard. Right. So the local economy has taken quite a big hit here. But, in the U.S., kind of state by state, we've decided kind of how much of a lockdown we want to be on. And Nevada's kind of somewhere in the middle, probably lockdown, but businesses are still open, with restrictions. I do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and our academy is open with, some restrictions. So my life has been just basically work and Jiu-Jitsu, which is kind of how it was before. So it hasn't been really interrupted that much, except I don't have to travel.
That sounds very karmic. Just work and Jiu-Jitsu.
There's something kind of very symbiotic about it.
Right. Nice.
Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, there's a dance called something like Tapuera, is it? Capoeira?
It's very different to Capoeira.
It's very different, is it? Okay, I wasn't sure. Because that's based on Brazilian, that's a Brazilian martial art, but based on dance, isn't it? If I'm right?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Thanks for you moving your arms around.
Well, I'm an expert, obviously.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, let's get into the deep dive. So, modernization. Dave, over to yourself and Jake.
Thanks, Jez. Jake, thanks again for coming on the pod. It's good to see you.
You as well. Thank you for having me.
So when we talk about modernization, we started the modernization conversation in Trend 5. And in Trend 5, we talk about adaptable organizations and what you need to do from an organizational perspective to fully adopt cloud-native living and working and really begin to start to drive out the full advantages. And in this trend, we're going to talk about tech. So the underlying technical opportunity that's given to us by something like a cloud transformation. The way we set this up in the trend is that the trend is called Don't Migrate, Modernize. But what it means is have a think about what you're trying to do and begin to start to think about the technology transformation that you ultimately need as being your end state. Doesn't mean you're going to move there all in one giant leap. In the modernized tech underlying kind of headlines, we cover data lakes, data backend, data platforms, we cover microservices and what microservices are in the middle. And then at the front end, we talk about channel experience and user experience and customer journey. And the fact that having a layered architecture like that can create lots of optimization for innovation. You can innovate channels without disrupting the back end. You can do data mining. You can do analytics at the back end without interrupting your channel experience, and a myriad of other things across kind of a modern cloud native architecture. But the challenge is in the world of the pandemic, which is really where we've been for the last year and are likely to be feeling the ramifications of for some time, there has been a need for speed. And what speed means is that you might not choose to do all of that level of technical transformation as part of your migration. So let's start, Jake, by just digging into some of the challenges that are inherent in that. So what are your experiences of speed of migration versus in-flight modernization?
Yeah, it just so happens I have some opinions on this. So
I was hoping so.
Yeah, I think it's always been about speed. I think regardless of kind of our current situation, one of the things that I do and my team does is we recognize the overall patterns and what we call anti-patterns of successful transformation. So the things that people who are successful, what they have in common, the people that are less successful, what they have in common. And there's a very strong correlation between the speed of migration and how successful they ultimately are. And there's a lot of reasons for this. In my mind, it's really about momentum. Transformations are difficult because change is difficult for human beings to really embrace in general. And so the longer you kind of are in that state of change, of the biggest change, the more opportunities there are for it to get stalled out. So I kind of bias very heavily towards a lift and shift In fact, my migration at Live Nation, we aimed for a lift and shift. We settled upon what's now called minimal viable refactoring. And what essentially that means is, we move things as quickly as possible, but there's certain dimensions or attributes that we're not willing to make any worse, right? So it's like a Hippocratic oath of IT, first do no harm. So for us, it was security compliance, cost, and resiliency. So as long as we didn't make any of those worse, we would count that as migrated. The intention is to circle back and optimize.
Is that more of a re-platform? You know the 6R sort of conversation.
Right.
Would you say that would fall into that?
I'm not a big fan of the 6Rs, and we can get into that as well. I think it's overly complex, and it confuses people, and it doesn't need to be that complex. I think it's all about, you start with the lift and shift, and then you decide how much refactoring you want to do. And you don't really need 6 different names for that, right? It's just, and that could be application by application basis. You don't have to have that consistent. But I wouldn't call it a re-platform because all of the refactoring that we do is at the infrastructure level. So an example would be, moving, like a monolithic database onto AWS, onto EC2 using Elastic Block Storage, EBS. We may have to, in the old days, before EBS had the SLAs that we need, like RAID mirror those volumes where we didn't have that on-prem. So that'd be an example of a refactor. It's at the infrastructure level, not at the application level or the platform level.
So it sounds like you advocate very heavily for speed of movement, which I think is not only entirely viable, but I think when you look at some of the market data, we did some market research to complement the trends. And what we saw in that market research was around about 30% of CIOs had been asked to accelerate their digital transformation plans as a result of the pandemic. And of course, going on within that term digital transformation could be a number of different things from, hey, we as a business now need to pivot towards online revenues versus the physical world revenues. It might be to do with their supply chain in terms of their business supply chain, or it might be just to do with the basics of, hey, we just want to get out of the physical data center. So what trends are you seeing, Jake, in the conversations you're having that underpins further your belief of like move fast and then modernize?
Well, the biggest thing is that the majority of executive teams that I work with, they tend to be stuck on step one. In other words, they're not migrated yet, and in some cases they've been planning for years. So, if that's the biggest problem, then moving past that problem as quickly as possible, in my mind, is the solution. And the other reason I believe that is because those that do get past step one tend to kind of get to step 2, 3, and 4. And the further along you go, the more likely you are to get to the finish line. And there really isn't a finish line, to be honest, because like I was saying before, we had this at Live Nation, we had this thought that we were going to come back and do a phase 2 of optimization. What ended up happening was that phase 2 never ended. That optimization just becomes part of your operations. And so there really isn't a finish line in that sense, but there is a finish line, in terms of retiring your old data center assets and not having to pay for them anymore.
The move into that ongoing optimization mode. So away from thinking, hey, we have got a nice series of phases in a project and we'll get to the end of that project and life will return to normal. I think it's a common trend, isn't it, that at the other side of a cloud transformation, so much has changed. And your stance towards continual optimization is actually part of that modernization journey.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing is, because the change is so hard for organizations in general, the fewer changes you can make in the beginning, the easier it is for them to kind of accept it and embrace it. And so like in the case of a lift and shift or a minimal viable refactor, everyone outside of the infrastructure team, it could be completely transparent. I would say it's transparent, except for the case that things are more reliable and performance issues get addressed more quickly, and hopefully costs go down as well. But other than that, their applications and their workflows shouldn't be disrupted, at least initially.
So let's talk about the never-ending phase 2. So if you're in a situation where you've moved a bunch of stuff to the cloud, and then you need to do something with it. So I'm interested to hear that you managed to demonstrate some cost saving as a result of that first move. It might be interesting to start there and talk about what were the elements that you actually managed to wring cost out of as part of that first move. We see some trend that if that's done in an uncontrolled way, that can be a cost problem.
Yes. Yeah. So first of all, I'd say, it's important to realize that governance is much more important in the cloud than out of the cloud, like in the data center. And the reason is because you have so much more capability and you have so few barriers towards getting things done. And that's a double-edged sword, right? On the one hand, you can accomplish your goals, but on the other hand, it's pay for consumption. So you pay for what you use. So this requires a completely different way of thinking about IT, infrastructure, IT, and business in general, in my opinion. In the old days, in the data center, there was really no incentive to go and find unused resources because it was sunk cost. You already paid for it. So, in fact, a lot of people would think, well, I'm going to get my money's worth out of it, and I want to get utilization as high as possible, right? But the problem is we tend to take our old way of thinking when we go into this new paradigm. So we take our operations that were in the cloud, on-prem into the cloud, and it works, but it's not an optimal way to be, right? So you can definitely reduce your costs, for example, by just going and taking a look at what your utilization is and then what your capacity is and trying to get those things to match as much as possible.
So then describe to us the modernization motion that you see off the back of that. So you've now moved to the cloud. Mm-hmm. You have got your governance in place. You're managing your new cloud environment. Data center's closed. Initial bit of the business case and the journey, let's call it done. The business at this point then is wanting to move into different ways of working. It's maybe thinking about spinning up products in a different way or pivoting some of their business into new customer experiences and new digital experiences. How did you take that optimization of the cloud motion and turn that into a more radical modernization?
So it's interesting. I'm of the opinion that even if you lift and shift all your old junk into the cloud, once you're in the cloud, you're going to organically kind of embrace these cloud native services eventually. And it happens more quickly than people usually predict. Now, of course, it's better to have a deliberate effort to do that, but I think just being in the cloud helps you do that. And so, like an example, a lot of companies will do what's the so-called cloud first strategy, where they leave all their legacy systems in their data center, but all new development goes in the cloud. And the problem with that is they often run into blockers where there's dependencies on the systems that are in the data center. And so you have this kind of split brain type of thing, and in a lot of cases will force you to start developing back in the data center again because that's where your dependencies are. So simply by having your dependencies in the cloud, it frees you from having to worry about that and allows you to build all your new systems using things like serverless and distributed NoSQL databases and things like that.
Do you think the fact that you also have much more transparency into what it's costing you? Like in a data center, it's all capitalized, it's depreciating. Mm-hmm. You're not really feeling the day-to-day pain of cost. Yet you put it up, lift and shift it, you drop it into the cloud. You're seeing that pain on a, by minute or hourly basis. And that could perhaps be a catalyst for you to go, there must be a cheaper way of doing this or a more efficient way of doing this.
Oh, absolutely. I would say you can't effectively cost optimize without that transparency. To have that transparency, you kind of have to set it up properly. Otherwise, you just have this big number with cloud next to it, right? So
but maybe that's the driver, right? You go, oh, cloud, huge number, right? How do I fix
But then
this?
Who's accountable for that cost? Yeah. So this kind of differs by organization. A lot of organizations, IT will wholly own that cost, but IT isn't the only stakeholder, right? So if IT wants to kind of reduce an instance size, for example, because it's over provisioned, they may not get approval to do that because if you look at it from a stakeholder outside of IT's perspective, it's a moral hazard. They, if they say yes, then they have this risk that their application won't perform as well. But then they also have no benefit because if the cost gets reduced, it doesn't affect their budget. So it's a really difficult situation to be in. So you have to create a situation where there's accountability, that the cost is, at least some accountability. It doesn't have to be complete accountability. It could even be, in a lot of cases, in fact, I think this is the most common use case. IT owns the cost, but they report out per application how much everything costs. So at least there's some transparency there. And then you can kind of shame the other business units and stakeholders into cooperating with you and in reducing those costs.
Yeah, gamify it.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So have a who's costing the company the most leaderboard.
Well, let's take that as a jumping off point on to continuing to walk up the stack and maybe actually stepping into the business now. So looking at the cloud environment from the perspective of the business owner who might get one of those showback style bills that we've just talked about. If we look at, again, some of the stats we've gathered, around why organizations are moving to the cloud, and what does it give them the opportunity to innovate around. So first of all, 82% of surveyed CIOs identified accelerating digital transformation as a core reason for moving to the cloud in the first place. That's interesting because that's not the same as saying cost reduction. Mm-hmm. So that's good. That's quite a different place probably to where we were a few years back. And then very briefly, organizations seeking to look to do something with the cloud, 61% of which talked about user and customer experience, 47% talked about new products and services, and 41% talked about their business model and how they were actually organizing around the cloud, or rather organizing around their services and increasingly tech-based services. So let's walk through the process of innovating the technology then based on something like that, Jake. What have you seen as being an effective method of, say, taking any one of those? Let's take customer experience as one of them, and building that more deeply into your sort of tech stack and the organization around the tech stack?
Well, there's a lot of things that contribute to embracing cloud, improving business functions like customer experience and everything else. And I think that these are kind of very simple concepts, but I don't know if they're fully understood by everyone, because I think there's a disconnect between what people say is their reason for going to the cloud and what the reasons actually are. In my experience, and I would say this is probably even true in my case as a customer, we moved to the cloud because there's some vague reason that we should. Right? It's like a modern way to do, or digital transformation, which, by the way, what does that even mean? I don't know what digital transformation means. Mm-hmm. It could mean anything you want it to mean, right?
Many things, many people.
Exactly. So that's not a reason. I want to digitally transform is not a reason. So they go in with kind of these vague reasons, usually based on what smart people tell them they should do, but they don't fully understand what those reasons are. So they kind of say these things, but then they realize these benefits just by doing it. You don't have to know why you're doing it or why you should do it in order to realize the benefits. If you do it, you're likely to realize the benefits, especially if you follow best practices. You're almost certain to realize the benefits. So some of these things that you can do in IT that affect your business as a whole, a very simple one is just time to market, right? And I think this. Everyone talks about time to market, but I'll give you an example. At Live Nation, we had a 3 to 6 month lead time to deploy resources just to do a proof of concept in the data center. And we got that down to 72 hours. Going from 3 to 6 months to 72 hours is quite a big jump. And, in reality, we could have done it. We could have had an SLA of 30 minutes if we wanted to, but we just decided to have some governance in place and put that down to 72 hours. So if you think about how much of a game changer that is to business, imagine your competitors can do that and you can't do that. How are you going to compete with them? Now, add to that the fact that cloud is what we call at Amazon a two-way door versus a one-way door, meaning a one-way door decision is something you walk through and you kind of have to live with those consequences. It's very hard to come back. A two-way door, you walk through it, you don't like the consequences, you walk back, and very inexpensive and quick to do so. And so in the old days, deploying infrastructure was a one-way door. You spent that money at that sunk cost, and you kind of had to live with it. And what that did is it drove behavior that was kind of throwing, good money after bad kind of situation. People would try something, it didn't work, and then they would keep trying, even though it was a bad idea. Now in the cloud, what businesses are doing is they're trying things. And first of all, they're more likely to try things because they have this capability. They try a bunch of things, the things that aren't, a home run. For example, it doesn't even have to be a good idea. You can just say, out of these 20 things we tried, what are the 3 best ones? We keep those and we get rid of the rest. And no one even remembers those 17 things that weren't perfect. And so you keep doing that and you keep doing that, and you end up with this much more valuable portfolio of applications within your organization and projects and services that you offer to your customers than you would if you're stuck in the data center. It's completely night and day.
I think interesting you bring up the two-way door cultural cue, because when I was doing a similar thing to what you did at Live Nation, I did at BP, and we used a two-way door that we'd picked up off an Amazon conversation quite early days. It's probably 7-8 years ago. And what's interesting about that is it really does change mindsets. Just thinking about things in a different way, and we used it to unlock the risk conversation, because we were managing risk very, very, very tightly. And as a result of doing that, it slows things down. And sometimes that can be a positive thing, and sometimes that can be a very blocking thing. So two-way door is a really good enabler for innovation and modernization, I think.
I think it's the biggest enabler, to be honest with you, whether you call it that or something else. That concept has so many wonderful side benefits. Like, for example, if you think about it, for the first kind of level of this is to recognize the two-way doors versus the one-way doors. Because what ends up happening in most organizations, they treat all decisions as one-way doors. And if you have a one-way door decision, you have to really be sure about your decision. And to be really sure, it takes a lot of effort and time to make that decision. And so what you end up doing is, like, all of your decisions, you end up taking a lot of effort and time to make. So you can make very few of them and you move very slowly. So, companies, they love talking about being agile and all of these things and moving quickly. But the real key to it is identifying which of those decisions are two-way doors and then doing no analysis and just going through it. And the analysis is, what is the result of doing, right? Now, the next level of that, in my opinion, is to take some of those one-way doors and turn them into two-way doors. So you've recognized the two-way doors and one-way doors. Now let's try to eliminate as many of those one-way doors as possible, because ideally you want all your decisions to be two-way doors. That way you can move very quickly with very low cost of failure. And that's, I think, where the real innovation comes from.
Very solid piece of advice. And maybe to wrap up, let's just zoom out again and look at the world that we're in, which is a number of organizations now have either jump-started their cloud transformation by having to move, say, collaboration technologies onto the cloud. They've very quickly recut things like their networks, and the cloud is already becoming more centric in the way that they're working. I'm sure a lot of and we've already seen this from a CloudReach perspective, an uptick in large-scale migrations, and as you've been saying, Jake, quite a heavy focus now on very fast migrations and looking to automate those migrations as far as possible, basically to get the dirty job of actually getting up onto the cloud out of the way. So what would be your final piece of advice for an organization that is now, coming out of the pandemic, they've got that kind of semi-cloud infrastructure in place? What will be the next steps?
So we're talking about an organization that's already moved to the cloud?
I think an organization that's come out of the pandemic, they've got some of their collaboration infrastructure now on the cloud. They've maybe moved the odd app, or they've got some organic cloud, and now they've maybe got an appetite to actually do more or move more quickly. What would be the advice?
Okay, so I would say the biggest thing is to start before you feel ready. And again, it's kind of another cliche, but this is the key. You're never going to feel 100% prepared to do this. And if you can do it in a way, and AWS will help you with this, to where you can minimize the cost of failure, you don't have to be so cautious in moving forward. And it's interesting because I deal with a lot of executives that are very risk averse, and they use that as kind of a reason not to move forward. But I argue that in many cases, not moving is the bigger risk. If you think about it in terms of your business, you have to compete in the marketplace. You have customers that you need to satisfy. And these customers, the bar for satisfying them is going up as companies are getting better. And one of the reasons is because they're powered by things like cloud, and they're able to provide better services. So you need to keep up with that. Not keeping up with that is probably the biggest risk. It's an existential risk. And so moving forward and, having a few missteps along the way, especially if you take the time to kind of minimize the cost of those missteps, is the winning strategy.
I would also say as well, the missteps are part and parcel of the learning journey.
Yes.
So, you could plan for a decade and you're still going to make some missteps.
Yeah. As long as that's an internal conversation, you're not really learning. You think you might be learning, but you don't learn until your ideas hit reality.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think the other thing probably to be a bit cautious about is, and I fully agree with you, Jake, do the lift and shift, get on the cloud, start consuming it, understand what your options are, look at the cloud native services. Just be conscious though that you don't start building up a whole bunch of tech debt by not doing it. And in 5 years' time, you go, "God, I wish I would done that." I think you do have to make that mental choice to actually do the modernization.
I think that the organizations that tend to be successful at a large scale are the ones that make a commitment, like a very rigid commitment, and they say, "We're doing this," and there's a deadline. And then if you do that, and you empower your teams and you allow them to kind of make those low cost mistakes, they'll run with it, right? They'll find a way to make it happen. And I would say it's kind of almost counterintuitive, but you want to make the deadline kind of unreasonable.
yeah,
because
exactly.
If you can get people enthusiastic about doing a transformation, and one of the ways you could do that is by kind of saying, like, here's a goal that no one's reached before. Like for me, my CEO gave us a deadline of 12 months. go all in on AWS in 12 months. And that seemed impossible. If I didn't have that impossible goal, I don't think we would have achieved it. Now, we migrated in 17 months, but if he gave us 24 months, maybe it would have taken 30 months. Right?
Yeah.
So I'm a big fan of setting, really difficult, challenging goals, and then, motivate your team, invest in your team, right? Because you need them on your side, and then they'll figure out a way.
Take that moonshot.
Mm-hmm. That's it.
Great. Thank you, Jake. That was fantastic. Really, really good conversation there. Okay. So that takes us on to the TSRs, our 10-second recommendations, where we like to just recommend something to our listeners. Just something you can do. Lockdown is obviously all driving us a little crazy. Just get out of the work head a little bit. Let's go to Dan. Dan, Producer Man, what do you have for us?
I am recommending a TV show that I believe a previous guest had mentioned, but wasn't really a full TSR. But I've gone and done the homework and I watched it. I actually binged the entire season last night because I watched the first couple of episodes and just couldn't stop. But Ted Lasso, so it's on the on Apple TV or Apple Plus or whatever it's called. I genuinely can't remember. But the show itself is fantastic.
Apple TV Plus.
Apple TV Plus, is that it?
It's all of the words that you said.
Apple TV
Oh,
Disney
perfect.
Plus.
Well, look, let's get to the matter at hand again. The show is brilliant. So it's about a American football coach who somehow ends up coaching a Premiership team, and it's brilliant. It's so well done. The mixture of sort of both American humor and UK humor just works perfectly. The showrunner is one of the showrunners is Bill Lawrence, who was the showrunner for Scrubs, which is one of my sort of favorite sitcoms of all time. And yeah, like that sort of level of humor is just still in there. But yeah, honestly, I recommend it to anyone, even people who probably just don't understand football or soccer in the States. It's just a load of fun, and it's got a lot of heart to it as well.
Brilliant. I'll definitely give that a go. Jake, what do you have for us?
Oh, well, I kind of collect these, but I'll pick one. So I'm notoriously not a morning person. I have a very hard time waking up, but I've been something I've been working on for a long time. And one thing that I've changed in my routine that's been made a complete, like over 20 years that I've been fighting this, that's made the biggest difference is as soon as I wake up, I go outside and I run a mile every morning.
That is good advice.
It's one of those things, it's probably good just to stay in shape, but something about the combination of sunlight and getting your heart rate up before your body wants to, if you're not a morning person, makes it easier to wake up the next morning and seems to have a compounding effect. So it's been really helpful for me. So anyone, it's kind of like unsung sufferers, I guess, so to speak. People who are not morning people, that nobody really has any sympathy because you look lazy in the morning. You don't want to, but it's really, everybody has a different kind of circadian clock, right? And some people are on extremes. So if you are one of those people, if you're a night owl, try it. I think you'll like it.
Well, I don't want to sort of send us down a rabbit hole, but is that sort of awareness come from like a similar place to the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu? Because I know a few people who have sort of done that. And like the idea of like, the patience involved, the use of your mind in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is very much attuned to like what your body's capable of and stuff like that. But is that kind of a similar sort of practice you have then?
Well, I do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu almost daily too, but it's not for sleep. I think that's just more to stay in shape. It's extremely fun, and it's a useful skill to have, and it's kind of like therapy, People talk about being in the zone. Everyone wants to be in the zone. Well, to be in the zone, it requires a few things. It requires high stakes. It requires competency, and it requires kind of the being forced to think of one thing and nothing else. So when I'm a couple hours a day that I'm in jiu-jitsu, somebody's trying to choke me out, and I'm trying to defend that and I'm trying to get them. You really don't have any time to think about work and all the other stresses of life. So it's definitely therapeutic. If I get two things to say, I would suggest you try out Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I highly recommend it.
Good stuff, Jez. I think you're going to come from the same sort of place here, so go on, get on with it.
I've given up alcohol for a while, and I'm into week 3, and I must say I'm really enjoying it. I really didn't think I would. I always like a glass of wine at weekends and occasional evenings, but yeah, not had a drink for 3 weeks, and I must say it has a really positive effect on the body. Don't worry, I'm not going to become a born-again teetotaler and get all evangelistic on you. I am quite looking forward to having another drink. Probably not for, I think I've set a goal of 2 months. See how we get on with it. But yeah, I could just give it a go. I'm very surprised at the positive impact.
I don't know whether you do dry January in the US, Jake, but it's where New Year, you stop drinking for the whole of January. So you take the bleakest month of the year and then make it bleaker by cutting wine out. And it's generally a pretty unpleasant month. But what you find is that you definitely feel better for it. I definitely subscribe to that. But do you not find you've got loads of time on your hands?
No, because I'm working really hard.
Oh.
You're not supposed to lie on this, Jed.
See this thing at the bottom of the screen. This is a truth machine.
Dave, what have you got for us?
Yes, so spurred on a bit by your enthusiastic embracing of a previous recommendation, I'm going to go music. Just before Christmas, Paul McCartney released McCartney 3, which is the third of his sort of trilogy of slightly, kind of more alternative records. And he released one in 1970, one in 1980, and then he made one in 2020 as part of the lockdown. And I wasn't into post-Beatles McCartney at all. I'd not bothered with it at all, other than hearing stuff like the Frog Chorus, which most people have been subjected to. I'd not really gone there. But I'd ordered a couple of records on vinyl, and they sent me McCartney 3 by mistake. And I rang them up and said, you didn't take it away. And anyway, cut a long story short, they let me keep it. So I listened to McCartney 3. I really, really liked it. And so immediately went and bought first presses of McCartney 1 and 2, which you can get really reasonably for those record collectors out there. Anyway, so that's my recommendation, McCartney 1, 2, and 3, the slightly off-the-wall alternative side of Paul McCartney.
Excellent. Yeah, once he was in Wings, I was like...
Right, same.
I literally thought you were about to recommend Wings when you first mentioned it.
I tricked you. But McCartney 2 is my favourite. McCartney 2 is it'll be late 70s. It came out in 1980, so late 70s sort of experimentation with synths and stuff like that. And you can hear the Berlin era David Bowie in it, and you can hear a bit of Kraftwerk in it. But it's all kind of shot through with, McCartney's undeniable melodic talents. Good stuff.
Brilliant. Great. Thank you, Jake. Thanks for coming on the pod. A really, really interesting chat. I think that's really helped with the whole sort of modernization trend. And great to have you. Would love to have you back on the show sometime. Obviously, you've got your own podcast, AWS Conversation with Leaders. So please, listeners, do give that a go. Dan, Dave, thanks for coming on. Always good to see you.
Always a pleasure, sir.
Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, guys. It was a lot of fun.
Oh, it's our pleasure. It's been great. Thank you, Jake. We are on Twitter at CloudBustingPod. Please do feel free to tweet us. And we are all on LinkedIn. Please do feel free to connect to us. Jake, you're on LinkedIn as well, and our listeners can connect to you.
Yes, just search for Jake Burns. You'll find me.
Excellent. We'll be back next time. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.